David Smith sat in his unmarked car, the engine off, windows cracked just enough to let the warm summer breeze slip through, carrying the faint scent of freshly mowed grass and blooming flowers. The quiet suburban street stretched out before him, a perfect row of identical houses with lawns so neatly trimmed they looked like they'd been sculpted, white picket fences gleaming in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun. Not a soul was in sight, yet David's eyes were locked on the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. He'd been parked here for hours, his target holed up inside since the early morning. "Stay sharp, David," he whispered to himself, his voice low, almost a growl, urging his focus to stay razor-edged. His hands flexed on the steering wheel, every nerve tingling with anticipation. That suspect wasn't going to hide forever. When would they make their move? If they didn't soon, David would know something was seriously wrong. As the sun dipped lower, bathing the neighborhood in a golden haze, David stayed still, heart pounding, ready for anything. Could this be the moment everything changes? Meanwhile, Officer Ray Carter cruised slowly through the neighborhood, his patrol car's engine purring softly, blending into the eerie stillness of the suburban streets. It was another quiet day, just the way Carter liked it. This part of town was a haven of calm, with pristine lawns, spotless sidewalks, and folks who waved at cops with friendly smiles. But as he rounded the corner, something snagged his attention, an unmarked car parked at the far end of the street, sitting just a bit too far from the curb. Carter's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening. That car didn't belong here. Too plain, too out of place in this polished, picture-perfect world. He eased his cruiser past, craning his neck to get a look at the driver. A black man alone, just sitting there. Why here of all places? Carter's grip tightened on the wheel, his mind racing with suspicion. What's a guy like that doing in a neighborhood like this? He's got no business here unless he's up to no good. Carter kept the car in his rearview mirror as he rolled by, noting no movement, not even a twitch. "What's your deal, huh?" he muttered under his breath, his gut churning with unease. He pulled his cruiser over a few houses down, careful to keep enough distance to avoid looking too obvious. Grabbing the radio, he kept his tone casual but sharp. "Unit 2 to 4, checking out a suspicious vehicle near Maple Drive. Black male in the driver's seat, no visible plates. I'm going in for a closer look." The dispatcher's acknowledgement crackled through, but Carter was already out of the car, adjusting his belt, making sure his badge shone in the fading sunlight. His mind was a whirlwind, weighing his options. Maybe the guy was lost, but really, who was he kidding? He'd seen this play out too many times. A black guy in a nice neighborhood?
Déteste trouble waiting to happen.
As Carter approached the driver's side window, his posture stiffened, every muscle on edge. The man inside sat calmly, glancing up to meet Carter's gaze without so much as a flinch. That cool composure set Carter's nerves on fire. Why wasn't this guy rattled? He rapped his knuckles sharply on the glass, the sound cutting through the quiet like a warning shot. The man didn't even blink. "Afternoon," Carter said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the edge in it was unmistakable, sharp as a blade.
Quelle toute-elle voiture doit ir.
The man, who looked to be in his late 30s, rolled down the window with a slow, deliberate motion, his face calm, his expression as controlled as a seasoned operative. Carter's irritation flared. Nobody should be this composed. "I'm working," the man said, his voice even, almost too smooth. "I'm with the government, just on duty." He kept his hands firmly on the wheel, no sudden moves, which only made Carter more uneasy. This guy's been through this before, hasn't he? Too comfortable with cops. Carter's frown deepened, his skepticism boiling over like a pot left too long on the stove. "Government, huh? Got any ID to prove that?" "Yeah, I do," the man replied, cool as a cucumber. "It's in the glove compartment. I can grab it if you want." Carter didn't budge, didn't even blink. His suspicion was a living thing now, clawing at his instincts. This guy was too calm, too collected, like he had all the answers. Guys like this didn't belong in places like this, and they sure didn't have government jobs, at least not the kind that had them parked in cars on quiet streets. Carter had seen enough to know better. He stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt, inches from his holster. "Let's hear it. What kind of government work are you supposedly doing here? And don't make any sudden moves, got it?" The man's eyes flicked briefly to Carter's hand, then back to his face, steady as a rock.
À mon fédéral surveillance opération.
"Can't share details, but I'm supposed to be here." Carter's eyes narrowed to slits.
Surveillance?
That's a good one. Last I checked, we handle that kind of thing around here. Never heard of any federal op in my neighborhood. The man's expression didn't waver, not a crack in his calm facade. You wouldn't hear about it. It's classified. That was it, the final straw. The tone, the cool, almost condescending way this guy spoke, like Carter was some clueless rookie who didn't know his own beat. Like this guy was untouchable, above the law. Carter's jaw clenched, his patience fraying like a worn-out rope.
You mind stepping out of the car?
It wasn't a question, it was a command, his voice low, forceful, dripping with authority. The man's eyes stayed locked on Carter's, hands still on the wheel, unflinching. Look, I'm just doing my job here. My ID's in the glove compartment. Check it, and this'll all clear up.
Carter shook his head, stepping closer, the tension between them crackling like a live wire.
Here's how this is gonna go. You're stepping out of that car, nice and slow, and then we'll sort this out.
Understand.
For a moment, the man didn't move, just stared at Carter, as if weighing whether to push back or comply. Was he sizing Carter up? Finally, he let out a faint exhale, frustration barely visible. All right, he said softly, almost too quietly.
You'll step out.
Carter's eyes never left him as the man unlocked the door and opened it, his movements slow, deliberate, like he knew exactly how to play this game. He was complying, sure, but that unshakable calmness? It grated on Carter's nerves, like this guy thought he was still calling the shots. Carter wasn't having it, not today, not here. As the man stepped out, Carter's hand hovered closer to his holster, every instinct screaming that he couldn't trust this situation. The man stood tall, hands visible, but there was something in his stance, the way he carried himself, that didn't sit right. He didn't look like a criminal, but Carter had learned the hard way, appearances could lie, especially when it was a black guy in a car that didn't belong in a place like this. No way was Carter letting his guard down, not now, not ever.
Envers et quand si aime.
Carter barked, his voice harder, more commanding, slicing through the still air like a whip. The man complied, raising his hand slightly, but his eyes stayed locked on Carter's, calm, controlled, like he'd danced this dance 100 times before. That only fueled Carter's anger. Who does this guy think he is? He's in my custody now, and whatever story he's spinning, I'm gonna get to the bottom of it. David stood beside his car, hands raised just enough to show compliance, his gaze steady on Officer Ray Carter. This wasn't his first rodeo, far from it. He'd been through the same tired routine too many times, the same tension, the same suspicion. He could read the signs like a book, the way Carter's body language shifted, the way his hand hovered near his waist, itching for a reason to escalate. This wasn't going to end easily, was it? Carter stepped closer, closing the gap between them, his tone sharp, dripping with condescension. Let's try this again. What are you really doing here? David kept his voice steady, refusing to let the officer's hostility rattle him.
À mon fédéral surveillance opération.
I've already told you, officer. My ID's in the glove compartment, it'll clear everything up. Carter's skepticism was palpable, his words laced with disdain.
Fédéral surveillance? Au convenient.
So you're just sitting here in this nice neighborhood, no plates on your car, keeping an eye on things, right? David felt the sting of Carter's tone, but he didn't flinch. Staying calm was his only way through this mess. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, his voice even. Just check my ID, and you'll see I'm on official duty. Carter shook his head, slow and deliberate, like he'd heard every excuse in the book.
Yeah, ibe you veux go ta real slick story.
People like you always do. But that doesn't explain why you're parked here, looking all suspicious. David's jaw tightened, but he kept his cool.
People like you?
There it was, that familiar jab, the one he'd heard in countless forms from countless people. You know what I mean, Carter snapped, his eyes raking over David, sizing him up. You don't belong here, and I've got a job to do. So unless you want this to get ugly, I suggest you quit talking and start cooperating. The accusation hung heavy in the air, a weight David had carried far too long. You don't belong here. How many times had he heard that? Officer, I'm trying to cooperate, David said, keeping his hands in plain sight. I'm not a threat, and I'm not breaking any laws. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Carter's smirk was cold, his eyes glinting with arrogance, maybe something darker.
Make it bigger?
You think I'm the one blowing this out of proportion? I'm just doing my job, keeping this neighborhood safe from people who don't belong. Now you gonna let me search that car, or do I need to slap cuffs on you? David's patience was wearing thin, the tension coiling tighter in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. There's no need for that. My ID's right there, just take a look, and you'll see I'm where I'm supposed to be. Carter's smirk vanished, replaced by a harder, more dangerous edge. You think I'm just gonna take your word for it, like you're some kind of big shot?
I don't care what you're doing here.
What I see is a guy in a car with no plates, in a neighborhood where he doesn't belong, acting like he's got something to hide. David shook his head slightly, frustration seeping through despite his best efforts.
I'm not hidden anything.
His voice was firm but controlled, a plea for reason. Carter stepped closer to the car, his tone mocking. Then you won't mind if I take a look around, will you? David's voice dropped, steady but urgent. I'm telling you, I'm on a federal operation. If you mess with this, you could jeopardize something way bigger than either of us. Carter's chuckle was hollow, devoid of humor.
Fédérale opération?
You really expect me to buy that? Guys like you, he caught himself, shrugging dismissively. Let's just say I don't care what story you're spinning. You're acting suspicious, and that's all I need to know.
David essaye loquet dont au Carteres, is calme extérieur masking the storm inside.
Officer, I don't want trouble, but you're making a mistake. Carter's gaze hardened, his voice icy. The only mistake here is you thinking you can fool me. Now, step back from the car. David didn't move, his mind racing, weighing every possible outcome. He'd been here before, in moments where reason didn't matter, where his skin color spoke louder than any truth he could offer. Last chance, Carter growled, his hand inching closer to his holster. Step back. David inhaled deeply, forcing the frustration to settle deep within him, keeping it tightly controlled. This doesn't have to go down like this, he said, his voice steady but pleading. Oh, it does, Carter shot back, his tone final, dripping with power. You think tossing around fancy words is gonna make me back off?
Newsflash, I'm in charge here, not you.
David stared at him, realizing words were useless now. This wasn't about facts or protocol, it was about control, and Carter was drunk on it. I'm just asking you to check my ID, David said, his voice low, almost a whisper. And I'm telling you to get back. Carter snapped, his hand now hovering over his holster, his stance rigid, unyielding. David took a slow step back, hands still visible, his heart heavy with the weight of this all-too-familiar dance. Carter wasn't listening, wouldn't listen. The situation had spiraled beyond reason, and David felt the crushing burden of being reduced to a stereotype, no matter what he said or did. How many times had he been here, caught in this same trap? Carter moved toward the car, his eyes scanning the interior with a predatory intensity.
I'm gonna take a look around, and you're gonna stay right there. Got it.
David didn't respond, just watched as Carter leaned in, searching with a methodical eagerness. It didn't matter that David had explained himself, that his ID was inches away. Carter had already decided the truth. After a moment, Carter straightened, turning back to David with a smug, self-satisfied grin.
Nothing suspicious, ou?
Well, you've still got some explaining to do. David's patience was gone, but his control held firm. He met Carter's gaze, his voice low, resolute.
You're wrong, officer, and this is gonna catch up with you.
Carter snorted, dismissing him with a wave. Sure it will. But right now, I'm the one calling the shots. David stood silent, his resolve unshaken. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He knew the truth would surface, and when it did, Carter would face the consequences of his arrogance. David's jaw clenched, his muscles tensing as he fought to keep his composure. Carter's smugness was unbearable, but David had to stay cool. Officer, he said, his voice steady but firm, you're making a huge mistake. I've been nothing but cooperative. I've told you who I am, why I'm here, and where my credentials are. Just look at them. Carter's eyes flashed with anger, his voice rising.
Cooperative?
You call this cooperative? Sitting in a car in a neighborhood where you don't belong, making me jump through hoops. He shook his head, his tone dripping with contempt. People like you always have a story.
I've heard em all.
There it was again, people like you. The words hit David like a punch, reigniting a familiar burn in his chest, a mix of frustration and anger he'd spent years learning to tame. This wasn't just about today, it was about every stop, every suspicious glance, every assumption he'd faced. "You're wrong," David said, his voice tight, barely above a whisper. "And when you figure that out, it'll be too late." Carter's face twisted into a sneer, his arrogance boiling over. "Is that a threat? You daring to threaten me?" David met his gaze, unflinching. "No, it's not a threat, it's the truth." For a moment, they stood locked in a silent standoff, David's calm clashing with Carter's bristling aggression. The air crackled with tension, the weight of it pressing down on David's shoulders. Carter's hand moved to his holster, resting there now, not just hovering. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice low, menacing.
He said, "Turn around."
David's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. "Officer, don't do this. I'm not resisting, but you're taking this too far. Just look at my ID." "I'm done with your ID." Carter snapped, his hand gripping his holster tightly.
Turn around and put your arm behind your back, now.
David hesitated, the danger of the moment sinking in. He could push back, demand Carter follow protocol, but one wrong move, one wrong word, and this could spiral into something far worse. Slowly, he turned, keeping his hands visible, the humiliation settling deep in his bones. How had it come to this, again? Carter moved fast, grabbing David's wrists roughly, snapping cold metal cuffs around them. David winced as the cuffs bit into his skin, but he stayed silent, the sharp click of the handcuffs echoing like a gavel in his mind. This was injustice, plain and simple. "You see how easy that was?" Carter taunted, his voice thick with triumph. "If you just cooperated from the start, we wouldn't be here." David stood still, refusing to give Carter the satisfaction of a response. He felt the officer's breath on his neck as Carter patted him down, searching for anything to justify this overreach. Of course, there was nothing. Satisfied, Carter yanked David toward the patrol car, shoving him against the door before opening it. David braced himself, his body tensing as Carter pushed him inside.
The hard plastic seat was cold, the air inside stifling, heavy with the weight of this moment.
Carter muttered to himself as he walked to the front, but David tuned him out. All he could hear was the click of those cuffs, the sound of his dignity being stripped away. Through the window, he saw Carter radioing in, probably gloating about his suspect. David leaned back, staring at the car's ceiling, his mind racing, not with fear, but with a deep, weary anger. He'd done everything right, stayed calm, explained himself, complied. And yet, here he was, cuffed in the back of a patrol car, treated like a criminal for one reason alone, Carter's prejudice. How many more times would he have to endure this? Carter slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine and glancing at David in the rearview mirror. That smug smile was back, like he'd won some grand victory. As they pulled away, David stared out at the tree-lined streets, the perfect neighborhood where he didn't belong. The weight of Carter's arrogance was suffocating, but David felt no fear, just a cold, simmering resolve. Carter might think he's won, but this isn't over. The truth would come out, and when it did, Carter would learn just how wrong he was. In the back of the patrol car, David sat, the cuffs digging into his wrists, his eyes fixed on the passing world. Quiet streets, pristine houses, lawns that screamed privilege. The irony was bitter. These folks had no clue what had just gone down in their idyllic little bubble. To them, it was just another day, but for David, it was a stark reminder of how quickly things could turn. Despite his training, his years of service protecting people just like these, he was reduced to a suspect, because he didn't fit Carter's idea of who belonged. How does it always come to this? Carter drove in silence, his smug satisfaction filling the car like a noxious cloud. Every now and then, David caught him smirking in the rearview mirror, like he'd just bagged a trophy. Carter thought he'd won, thought he'd done his job. But David knew better. This was no victory, just a mistake that would cost Carter dearly. The patrol car stopped at a red light, and Carter grabbed the radio with a cocky flourish. "Dispatch, Unit 24, he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "Bringing in a suspect. Black male, no ID, suspicious behavior in a restricted area." David's jaw tightened. Even now, Carter was twisting the truth, painting himself as the hero. But David stayed silent. He knew the truth would break through soon enough. The radio crackled, and the dispatcher's voice came through, Copy Unit 24. Send the suspect's details for processing. Carter paused, glancing at David in the mirror, his tone smug. Name. David stared out the window, refusing to make this easy. Why should he? Carter sighed, flipping open his notepad. David Smith, he said, his voice dismissive. No ID, claims he's on some federal surveillance nonsense.
And being it.
A long pause followed, longer than normal. Carter's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping impatiently.
Dispatch, you there.
Static crackled, then the dispatcher's voice returned, now serious. Hold on, Unit 24. Running that name now.
Stand by.
David watched Carter's smirk fade, replaced by a flicker of unease. The silence stretched, the tension in the car thickening.
Then the radio roared back to life.
Unit 24, confirm that name. Carter's grip on the wheel tightened, his voice uncertain.
Yeah, David Smith.
What's up? Another pause, and David saw Carter's confidence crumble. Unit 24, we've got a flag. David Smith is a federal agent, CIA. Repeat, you've got a CIA agent in custody.
The word it like a thunderclap.
David watched Carter's face drain of color, his smug grin vanishing. For the first time, Carter looked lost, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Say again, he stammered, his voice weak. CIA, the dispatcher repeated, firm and clear. Affirmative, Unit 24. Smith is with the CIA. Release him immediately. We'll handle it from here. Carter's eyes widened, panic creeping in.
David met his gaze in the mirror, calm and steady.
He didn't need to say a word, the truth was doing all the talking now. The car fell silent, the weight of Carter's mistake crashing down. David could see the officer's mind scrambling, searching for a way out. The arrogance, the swagger, it was all gone, replaced by raw fear. I didn't know, Carter stuttered, his voice trembling. I didn't know he was. David cut him off, his tone icy. You didn't care to know. Carter's face flushed, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the radio. Dispatch, Unit 24. I'll release the suspect. Copy. Copy, the dispatcher replied, curt and professional. Do it now. Carter dropped the radio, sitting frozen for a moment, his breathing ragged. He turned to face David, the smirk long gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate look. Look, I didn't know, he said, his voice pleading. You didn't say anything specific. If I'd known, David cut him off again, his words heavy with truth.
He told you.
You didn't listen. Carter's face reddened, his hands trembling as he reached for the door. He stumbled out, hurrying to the back and opening the door. David watched as Carter hesitated, his hands hovering over the cuffs, unsure, as if he could somehow undo this disaster. Finally, Carter fumbled with the keys, unlocking the cuffs. The metal clinked as it fell away, but the sting lingered. Carter stepped back, pale and shaken, his mouth opening and closing, searching for words, an apology, an excuse, anything to salvage this. But there was nothing to say. David stared at him, his expression blank, but his eyes burned with disappointment.
I'm sorry, Carter stammered.
I didn't. David didn't respond. Why should he?
The silence said it all.
He straightened his jacket, flexing his wrists, and stepped out of the car without a word. As he walked away, leaving Carter standing there, broken and speechless, David felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about today, it was about every time he'd been judged, dismissed, reduced. But he was still standing, and that was enough. The air between David and Carter was thick, heavy with the wreckage of what had just happened. David's steps were measured, his back straight as he walked away from the patrol car, refusing to look back. He didn't need to, Carter's defeat was palpable. The officer stood frozen, clutching the cuff keys, his face pale, his breath uneven. What had he done? His mind raced, grappling with the reality of his mistake, the consequences looming like a storm. David reached his car, the quiet street now eerily silent, as if the neighborhood itself held its breath, witnessing Carter's fall. Carter snapped out of his daze, scrambling back to his cruiser, his hands still shaking as he grabbed the radio. Dispatch, Unit 24, he said, his voice cracking. I've released the suspect, David Smith. He's free. The dispatcher's response was clipped, professional.
Copie, Uni 24.
Stand by for further instructions. Carter stared at the radio, his heart pounding. Further instructions? He knew what that meant. This wasn't going to end with a slap on the wrist. His mind replayed every moment, spotting David's car, the assumptions he'd made, the way he'd ignored every red flag because of David's skin color. He'd thought he was in the right, but now the truth was crushing him.
The radio crackled again.
Unit 24, report to the station immediately.
Supervisor want to speak with you.
Carter's mouth went dry, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Copy, he whispered, barely audible. He glanced at David, now adjusting his jacket by his car, looking unbothered, like this was just another day. Carter's stomach twisted. The power he'd wielded minutes ago was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread. As he started the car and pulled away, David's calm, steady face haunted him. He'd been so wrong. How could he have been so blind? David Smith shook his head slightly, frustration bubbling up despite his ironclad efforts to keep it at bay. I'm not hiding anything, he declared, his voice steady but laced with exasperation. How many times had he been in this exact spot, facing down suspicion for no reason at all? Officer Ray Carter stepped closer to the car, his eyes glinting with a mix of skepticism and arrogance. Then you won't mind if I take a look around, will ya? He said, his tone challenging, daring David to resist. David's voice dropped, firm but controlled, a warning wrapped in calm. I'm telling you, officer, I'm on a federal operation. If you interfere with this, you could jeopardize something way bigger than either of us. Carter's chuckle was cold, hollow, dripping with disbelief.
Fédérale opération?
Really? You expect me to swallow that? Guys like you, he stopped himself, his lips curling into a dismissive shrug. Let me put it this way, I don't care what story you're spinning right now. You're a guy acting suspicious, and that's all I need to know. David watched Carter carefully, his eyes narrowing as he studied the officer's every move. Officer, I don't want any trouble, but you're making a huge mistake, he said, his voice steady but urgent. Carter's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening like a coiled spring. The only mistake I see here is you thinking you can pull one over on me. Now, step back from the car. David didn't move, his gaze locked on Carter's, measuring the officer's next move with the precision of a seasoned agent. He knew where this was headed. Oh, he'd been here before. In situations where calm reasoning was drowned out by prejudice, where the color of his skin shouted louder than any truth he could speak.
Last chance.
Carter barked, his hand dropping closer to his holster, his voice a low growl. Step back. David inhaled slowly, forcing the frustration to settle deep inside him, keeping it tightly controlled but ever present. This doesn't have to go down like this, he pleaded, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. Why couldn't Carter just listen? Oh, but it does. Carter shot back, his tone dripping with finality, like he'd already written the ending to this story. You see, I know exactly what's going on here. You think throwing around fancy words is gonna make me back off? Well, here's the deal, I'm in charge now, not you. David stared at him, the realization sinking in that words were useless. This wasn't about protocol anymore, not about reason or facts. It was about power, pure and simple, and Carter was drunk on it. I'm just asking you to look at my ID. David said quietly, his voice low but firm, a final plea for sanity. And I'm telling you to get back. Carter snapped, his hand now hovering over his holster, his posture rigid, unyielding, like a wall of defiance. David took a slow step back, hands still visible, his heart heavy with the weight of this all-too-familiar dance. Carter wasn't listening, wouldn't listen. The situation had spiraled beyond reason, and David felt the crushing burden of being reduced to a stereotype, no matter what he said or did. How many times had he faced this same humiliation, this same dismissal? It was a burden he'd carried for years, but it never got any easier. Carter stepped toward the car, his eyes darting over the interior with a predatory intensity.
I'm gonna take a look around, and you're gonna stay right there. Got it.
David didn't respond, just stood there, watching as Carter leaned in to search the car, his movements methodical, almost eager, like he was hunting for a trophy to justify his actions. It didn't matter that David had explained himself, that his ID was within arm's reach. Carter had already made up his mind. The officer straightened up after a moment, turning back to David with a self-satisfied smirk that made David's blood boil.
Nothing suspicious, ou?
Well, you've still got some explaining to do. David's patience was gone, but his control held firm, a testament to years of training and resilience. He looked Carter dead in the eye, his voice low, resolute.
You're wrong, officer, and this is gonna catch up with you.
Carter snorted, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. Sure it will. But right now, I'm the one giving the orders. David stared at him, silent but unwavering, his resolve like steel. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He knew the truth would come crashing down on Carter, and when it did, that smug grin would vanish. David clenched his jaw, his muscles tensing as he fought to keep his composure in the face of Carter's unbearable arrogance. Officer, he said, his voice steady but firm, cutting through the thick tension. You're making a massive mistake. I've been nothing but cooperative. I've told you who I am, why I'm here, and where my credentials are. All you have to do is look. Carter's eyes flashed with anger, his voice growing louder, more aggressive.
Cooperative?
You call this cooperative? Sitting in a car in a neighborhood where you don't belong, making me go through all this trouble. He shook his head, his tone dripping with contempt. People like you always have a story.
I've heard et all.
There it was again, people like you. The word slammed into David like a fist, reigniting a familiar burn in his chest, a searing mix of frustration and anger he'd spent years learning to tame. This wasn't just about this moment, it was about every moment like this one, every stop, every suspicious glance, every assumption he'd faced. How many times had he been reduced to people like you?
You're wrong.
David said quietly, his voice tight, barely above a whisper, but heavy with truth. And when you realize that, it's gonna be too late. Carter's face twisted into a sneer, his arrogance boiling over like a volcano. Is that a threat? You daring to threaten me? David met his gaze, unflinching, his eyes burning with resolve. No, it's not a threat, it's the truth. For a heartbeat, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills, David's calm clashing with Carter's bristling aggression. The air crackled with tension, the weight of it pressing down on David's shoulders like a lead blanket. Carter's hand moved to his holster, resting there now, not just hovering, his fingers twitching with readiness. Turn around, he ordered, his voice dropping an octave, low and menacing.
He said, turn around.
David's pulse quickened, but he held his ground, his heart racing. Officer, don't do this, he urged, his voice steady but pleading. I'm not resisting, but you're taking this way too far. Just look at my ID. I'm done with your ID. Carter snapped, his hand now gripping his holster, his authority a weapon he wielded with glee.
Turn around and put your hand behind your back, now. David hesitated, the danger of the moment sinking in like a cold wave.
He could push back, demand Carter follow protocol, but one wrong move, one wrong word, and this could spiral into something far worse. Why did it always come to this? Slowly he turned, keeping his hands visible, the humiliation settling deep in his bones like a poison. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore, it was about power, and Carter was determined to show he had it all. David's pulse pounded in his ears as he placed his hands behind his back, feeling the weight of this injustice crushing him. Carter moved quickly, roughly grabbing David's wrists, snapping cold metal cuffs around them with a force that made David wince. The cuffs dug into his skin, but he stayed quiet, the sharp click of the handcuffs echoing like a death knell in his mind. This was wrong, so wrong. You see how easy that was. Carter taunted, his voice thick with self-satisfaction, like he'd just won a prize. All you had to do was cooperate from the start, and we wouldn't be here. David stood still, refusing to give Carter the satisfaction of a response, his silence a shield against the officer's cruelty. He could feel Carter's breath on the back of his neck as the officer patted him down, searching for something, anything, to justify this overreach. Of course, there was nothing. Once satisfied, Carter yanked David toward the patrol car, shoving him roughly against the door before opening it, the metal cold and unforgiving against David's shoulder. David braced himself, his body tensing as Carter pushed him inside, the force unnecessary, deliberate. The hard plastic seat was icy against his back, the interior of the patrol car stifling, the air thick with the weight of this moment. David could hear Carter muttering to himself as he walked to the front, but the words were meaningless noise. All David could hear was the click of those cuffs, the sound of his dignity being stripped away, echoing in his mind like a cruel refrain. Through the window, he saw Carter radioing in, probably gloating to his dispatcher about the suspect he'd just nabbed. David leaned his head back against the seat, staring up at the car's grimy ceiling, his mind racing, not with fear, but with a deep, bone-weary anger. He'd done everything right, stayed calm, explained himself, complied. And yet, here he was, handcuffed in the back of a police car, treated like a criminal for one reason alone: Carter's prejudice. How many more times would he have to endure this same tired script? Carter slid into the driver's seat, turning the ignition with a flourish, glancing at David in the rearview mirror. That smug smile was back, curling his lips like he'd just won some grand victory. As they pulled away from the curb, David stared out the window at the peaceful tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, the same streets where people like him didn't belong, according to Carter. The weight of the officer's arrogance was suffocating, pressing down on David's chest, but there was no fear, only a cold, simmering resolve. Carter might think he's won, but this isn't over. The truth would come out, and when it did, Carter would learn just how wrong he was. As they drove off, David remained silent, his mind already mapping out the next steps, calculating, strategizing. He would stay calm, stay in control. This wasn't over yet. David sat in the back of the patrol car, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, a constant reminder of this injustice. His eyes stayed fixed on the world passing by outside the window: quiet streets, pristine houses, perfectly manicured lawns that screamed privilege. The irony was bitter, twisting in his gut like a knife. These folks had no clue what had just gone down in their idyllic little corner of the world. To them it was just another day, but for David, it was yet another stark reminder of how quickly things could turn on a dime. Despite his experience, his training, his years spent protecting people just like the ones in these homes, here he was, treated like a criminal because he didn't belong. How does it always come to this? Carter drove in silence for a while, his smug satisfaction filling the car like a toxic fog, heavy and oppressive. Every so often, David caught him glancing into the rearview mirror, that slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, like he was savoring his triumph. Carter thought he had won, thought he'd done his job, put another suspect in his place. But David knew better. This was no victory, just a mistake that would cost Carter everything. The patrol car slowed to a stop at a red light, and Carter reached for the radio, picking it up with a casual flick of his wrist, his cockiness practically oozing through the air. "Dispatch, this is Unit 24, he said, his voice calm but laced with that same infuriating arrogance. "I'm bringing in a suspect. Black male, no ID, suspicious behavior in a restricted area." David's jaw clenched so tight it ached. Even now, after all this, Carter was twisting the truth, painting himself as the hero of this twisted tale. But David kept quiet, his silence a weapon, his resolve unshaken. He knew the truth would come roaring out soon enough, and when it did, Carter's world would crumble. The radio crackled with static, and the dispatcher's voice cut through: "Copy that, Unit 24. Send through the suspect's details for processing." Carter paused, glancing at David again in the rearview mirror, his tone smug, final, like he'd just sealed the deal. "Name." David remained silent, staring out the window, refusing to make this easy. Why should he? It wasn't his job to smooth over Carter's mistakes. Carter sighed, flipping open his notepad with an exaggerated huff. "David Smith," he said, his voice dripping with dismissal. "No ID, claims he's on some federal surveillance nonsense."
And doing it.
A long pause followed, longer than normal, the silence heavy with anticipation. Carter's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. "Dispatch, you there?" he snapped, his voice betraying a flicker of unease. Static crackled, then the dispatcher's voice returned, now serious, clipped. "Hold on, Unit 24. Running that name now."
Stand by.
David watched Carter's smirk falter, replaced by a shadow of doubt that crept across his face. The silence stretched, the tension in the car thickening like a storm cloud ready to burst.
Then the radio roared back to life, the dispatcher's voice urgent.
"Unit 24, confirm that name." Carter's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles whitening, his voice uncertain.
"Yeah, David Smith."
"What's up?" Another pause, and David saw Carter's confidence shatter like glass. "Unit 24, we've got a flag. David Smith is a federal agent, CIA. Repeat, you've got a CIA agent in custody." The words hit like a thunderbolt, electrifying the air. David watched Carter's face drain of color, his smug grin vanishing as if it had never existed. For the first time, Carter looked utterly lost, his mouth opening but no words coming out. "Say again," he stammered, his voice weak, trembling. "CAA," the dispatcher repeated, firm and clear, each syllable a hammer blow.
Affirmative, Uni 24.
"Smith is with the CIA. Release him immediately. We'll handle it from here." Carter's eyes widened, panic flooding his features like a tidal wave. David met his gaze in the rearview mirror, calm and steady, his silence louder than any words. He didn't need to say a thing. The truth was tearing Carter's world apart. The car fell silent, the weight of Carter's catastrophic mistake crashing down like a collapsing building. David could see the officer's mind scrambling, desperately searching for a way out, but there was none. The arrogance, the swagger, it was all gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered fear. I didn't know."
Carter stuttered, his voice shaking, barely above a whisper.
"I didn't know he was," David cut him off, his tone icy, cutting through the air like a blade. "You didn't care to know." Carter's face flushed crimson, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the radio, his fingers clumsy with panic. "Dispatch, Unit 24, he croaked, his voice cracking. I'll release the suspect." "Copy." "Copy," the dispatcher replied, curt and professional, the weight of authority unmistakable. "Do it now." Carter dropped the radio, his hands shaking so badly it clattered against the console. He sat frozen for a moment, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Slowly, he turned to face David, that smug smirk long gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate look that spoke of a man who'd just seen his career implode. "Look, I didn't know," he said, his voice pleading, almost pathetic. "You didn't say anything specific." "If I'd known," David cut him off again, his words heavy with the weight of truth, each one landing like a blow.
"He told you."
"You didn't listen." Carter's face reddened further, his hands trembling as he reached for the door handle, his movements jerky, unsteady. He stumbled out of the car, hurrying to the back and opening the door, his eyes avoiding David's as if he couldn't bear the shame. David watched as Carter hesitated, his hands hovering over the cuffs, unsure, as if he could somehow undo this disaster with a single act. Finally, Carter fumbled with the keys, his fingers shaking so badly it took him several tries to unlock the cuffs. The metal fell away with a dull clink, but the sting lingered, a burning reminder of the injustice David had endured. Carter stepped back, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, searching for words, an apology, an excuse, anything to salvage this wreck. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice breaking. "I didn't." David didn't respond. Why should he? The silence between them was deafening, saying more than any words ever could. He straightened his jacket, flexing his wrists to ease the ache, and stepped out of the patrol car without a backward glance. As he walked away, leaving Carter standing there, broken and speechless, David felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't just about today. It was about every time he'd been judged, dismissed, reduced to less than he was. But he was still here, still standing, and that was enough. The air between David and Carter was thick, heavy with the wreckage of what had just happened, a fog of shame and consequence neither could escape. David's steps were measured, his back straight as he walked away from the patrol car, refusing to look back. He didn't need to. Carter's defeat was palpable, radiating from him like heat from a fire. The officer stood rooted in place, clutching the cuff keys in a trembling hand, his face pale, his breath uneven, his mind racing to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. What had he done? How had it come to this? David reached his car, the quiet suburban street now eerily silent, as if the entire neighborhood held its breath, bearing witness to Carter's fall. Carter snapped out of his daze, scrambling back to his cruiser, his hands still shaking as he grabbed the radio, his voice cracking with panic. "Dispatch, Unit 24, he said, his words stumbling over each other. "I've released the suspect, David Smith. He's free." The dispatcher's response was clipped, professional, but heavy with unspoken judgment.
Copie, Uni 24.
"Stand by for further instructions." Carter stared at the radio, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Further instructions? He knew what that meant. This wasn't going to end with a simple apology. His mind replayed every moment, spotting David's car, the assumptions he'd made, the way he'd ignored every warning because of David's skin color, because he convinced himself he was in the right. But now, the truth was a crushing weight, and there was no escaping it. The radio crackled again, the dispatcher's voice cutting through like a blade. Unit 24, report back to the station immediately.
Supervisor want to speak with you.
Carter's mouth went dry, his hands trembling uncontrollably, the radio slipping in his sweaty grip. Copy, he whispered, his voice barely audible, swallowed by the dread pooling in his gut. He glanced at David, who was now standing by his car, adjusting his jacket as if nothing had happened, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Carter's unraveling. Carter's stomach churned, a sickening twist of fear and regret. The power he'd felt just minutes ago, the authority he'd wielded like a club, was gone, evaporated, leaving only a hollow dread in its place. As he started the car and pulled away from the curb, David's calm, steady face burned in his mind, a haunting reminder of his catastrophic error. He'd been so wrong, so terribly wrong. How could he have been so blind? Officer Ray Carter sighed heavily, his frustration mounting as he flipped open the small notepad he'd pulled from his pocket earlier, his fingers gripping it tightly. David Smith, he read aloud, his voice dripping with the same dismissive scorn he'd used since this whole mess started. No ID, claims he's on some kind of federal surveillance nonsense, but I ain't buying it, he scoffed, shaking his head as if the very idea was absurd. Why would a guy like that be involved in anything legit? The radio fell silent, an unusually long pause stretching out, heavy and ominous. Carter frowned, his impatience bubbling over as he tapped the steering wheel with restless fingers. "Dispatch, you still there?" he snapped, his tone sharp, annoyed. Static crackled for a moment, filling the patrol car with an eerie buzz, before the dispatcher's voice came back, now laced with a serious edge that made Carter's gut twist.
Hold on, Uni 24.
Running that name through our system now.
Stand by.
David Smith, still cuffed in the back seat, watched Carter through the rearview mirror, his calm gaze unwavering despite the cold metal biting into his wrists. He could see the officer's smug smirk start to falter, replaced by a subtle frown, a crack in the facade of unshakable confidence. The silence dragged on, each second thickening the tension in the car like a storm cloud swelling before a downpour. What was taking so long? Then the radio burst to life again, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. Unit 24, are you sure about that name? Carter's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles whitening, his fingers tapping nervously now, betraying the unease creeping into his chest. Yeah, I'm sure.
David Smith.
Why? He barked, his voice tinged with irritation, but there was a tremor in it, a hint of doubt. Another pause followed, longer, heavier, and David could see Carter's confidence wavering, crumbling like a house of cards. Unit 24, we've got a flag on that name. David Smith is a federal agent, CIA. Repeat, you've got a CIA agent in custody. The words slammed into the air like a thunderclap, freezing time in the cramped patrol car. David watched as Carter's face went pale, his smug smirk vanishing as if it had been wiped clean off his face. For the first time since this ordeal began, Carter looked utterly lost, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out, just a stunned, hollow silence.
Say again.
Carter finally croaked, his voice quieter now, strained, barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. See. The dispatcher's voice boomed back, firmer this time, each syllable a hammer blow to Carter's ego.
Affirmative, Uni 24.
Smith is with the CIA. You need to release him immediately. We'll handle the rest from here. Carter's eyes widened, his expression a chaotic mix of confusion and raw fear, like a man who just realized he'd stepped on a landmine. David met his gaze in the mirror, his face calm, his eyes steady, unyielding, a silent testament to the truth that was now unraveling Carter's world. He didn't need to say a word, the dispatcher's words were doing all the talking. The patrol car fell eerily quiet for a moment, the weight of Carter's colossal mistake crashing down on him like a tidal wave. David could see the gears turning in the officer's mind, frantically trying to figure out what to do next, how to escape the trap he'd built for himself. The arrogance, the swagger, that infuriating air of superiority, it all drained away in an instant, leaving Carter with nothing but the stark reality of the disaster he'd created. How could he have been so wrong? I didn't know. Carter stammered, his voice shaky, cracking under the pressure, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I didn't know he was, but David cut him off, his voice cold, firm, slicing through Carter's panic like a blade. "You didn't care to know." The accusation hung heavy in the air, a truth so sharp it seemed to pierce Carter's defenses. Carter swallowed hard, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and panic, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to process the magnitude of his error. He fumbled with the radio, his hand trembling slightly, his fingers clumsy as he tried to regain some semblance of control. "Dispatch, Unit 24 here," he said, his voice unsteady, almost pleading. I'll release the suspect." "Copy that." "Copy," came the dispatcher's reply, curt and professional, the tone leaving no room for excuses. "Make sure it's done right away." Carter dropped the radio back onto the console with a clatter, his hand shaking so badly it nearly fell to the floor. He sat there for a moment, frozen in stunned silence, his breathing rapid, uneven, like a man gasping for air after a sprint. David could hear each ragged breath, a testament to the officer's unraveling composure. Carter turned in his seat to face David, that smug smirk long gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate look of regret, his eyes wide with the dawning horror of what he'd done. His confidence had shattered, leaving only a shell of the man who'd been so sure of himself just minutes ago. "Look," Carter began, his voice low, almost pleading, the arrogance stripped away. "I didn't know. I mean, you didn't say anything specific." "If I had known," David cut him off again, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of truth, each word landing like a stone. "I told you. You didn't listen." Carter's face reddened further, his hands trembling as he reached for the door handle, his movements jerky, unsteady, like a man on the edge of collapse. He stepped out of the car quickly, practically stumbling in his haste, walking around to the back and opening the door with a shaky hand. David shifted slightly, watching as Carter hesitated, his hands hovering over the cuffs for a moment, his eyes darting from David's face to the restraints around his wrists, as if unsure of how to proceed, how to salvage this catastrophic situation. Carter didn't move, his breath hitching, his face a mask of panic and shame. Then slowly he fumbled with the keys, his fingers clumsy, trembling so badly it took several tries to unlock the handcuffs. The metal fell away with a dull clink, the sound echoing in the quiet street, but the weight of the moment lingered, heavy and unforgiving. Carter stepped back, his face pale as a ghost, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, searching for words, an apology, an explanation, anything to make this nightmare go away. But there was nothing he could say that would fix this, no words that could erase the mistake he'd made. David simply stared at him, his expression blank, but his eyes burned with unmistakable disappointment, a silent rebuke that cut deeper than any shout. Carter stammered, his voice breaking, barely audible. "I'm sorry." "I didn't." David didn't respond. Why should he? The truth was clear, and the silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. He straightened his jacket, flexing his wrists to ease the lingering ache, the marks from the cuffs a stark reminder of the injustice he'd endured. With measured calm, he stepped out of the patrol car without another word, his dignity intact despite Carter's attempts to strip it away.
David walked away, leaving Carter standing there, spinkle, broken, à main donne by his own prejudice.
The silence between David and Carter was thick, heavy, like a fog that neither could escape, suffocating in its intensity. As David walked away from the patrol car, his back straight, his steps deliberate, Carter stood rooted in place, still clutching the keys to the cuffs that had just been around David's wrists, his fingers trembling as if they could feel the weight of his mistake. The officer's face was pale, his breathing uneven, shallow, his mind racing to grasp what had just happened, and more terrifyingly, what was about to happen next. David didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was coming for Carter, the storm of consequences that would follow this monumental error. As David walked toward his car, the quiet suburban street felt even quieter, as if the entire neighborhood had fallen under a spell, hushed by the gravity of Carter's mistake. The air was still, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward Carter, accusing him. Carter finally snapped out of his daze, rushing back to his patrol car, his movements frantic, his hands still shaking as he grabbed the radio. "Dispatch," he said, his voice cracking, high-pitched with panic. "This is Unit 24. I've released the suspect, David Smith. He's free." There was a brief pause on the other end, a moment of silence that felt like an eternity, before the dispatcher responded, her tone clipped, professional, but heavy with unspoken judgment. "Copy that, Unit 24. Stand by for further instructions." Carter stared at the radio, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum, each beat a reminder of the trouble he was in. Further instructions? He knew what that meant. This wasn't going to blow over with a simple apology. His mind replayed every moment, a torturous loop, spotting David sitting in that unmarked car, the assumptions he'd made, the way he'd ignored every warning sign because of the man's skin color, because he convinced himself he was doing the right thing. But now, standing there, reality was sinking in, a cold, hard truth that left him breathless. How could he have been so blind? As he waited, his thoughts spiraled, each one a fresh stab of regret, the weight of his actions crushing him. The radio crackled again, the dispatcher's voice slicing through the silence like a guillotine. Unit 24, report back to the station immediately. Supervisor wants to speak with you. Over. Carter swallowed hard, his mouth so dry it felt like sandpaper, his hands, once confident, now trembling uncontrollably, the radio slipping in his sweaty grip. Copy that, he managed to say, his voice barely audible, swallowed by the dread pooling in his gut like poison. He glanced back at David, who was now standing beside his car, adjusting his jacket with a calm that seemed almost otherworldly, as if this whole ordeal was just a minor inconvenience. Carter's stomach churned, a sickening twist of fear and regret that made his knees weak. The power he'd felt just minutes ago, the authority he'd wielded like a weapon, had evaporated, leaving only a hollow, gnawing dread in its place. As he started the car and pulled away from the curb, the engine's hum doing nothing to drown out the chaos in his mind, Carter couldn't shake the image of David's calm, steady face, those piercing eyes that had seen right through him. He had been wrong, so wrong. And now he had to face the music, a reckoning he couldn't escape. The drive to the station felt endless, each mile a step closer to the consequences he dreaded. When Carter arrived, the atmosphere was different, colder, like the air itself had turned against him. His fellow officers didn't greet him with the usual nods or casual waves. There was a stiffness, a tension that screamed they knew. He hadn't even stepped inside, and already the whispers were circulating, a low hum of judgment that followed him like a shadow. He trudged through the station doors, his steps heavier than ever, his head bowed as if to shield himself from the stares. As he passed the front desk, he caught the receptionist's glance, her eyes darting away quickly, as if looking at him was too uncomfortable.
Word traveled fast. Too fast.
Carter. The sharp voice of his supervisor, Captain Hill, cut through the air like a blade, making Carter flinch, his heart racing as he turned to face the captain standing at the entrance to his office, arms crossed, his face a mask of stern disappointment.
Get in here.
Now. Carter's legs felt like jelly as he walked toward the office, the eyes of his colleagues burning into his back, the walls closing in, the fluorescent lights above harsh, unforgiving. This was the moment he'd been dreading since he left the scene. There was no escaping it now. He stepped into Captain Hill's office, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. The room was sparse, the only decorations being framed certificates and awards lining the walls, but none of that offered Carter any comfort, only a reminder of what he stood to lose. The captain sat down behind his desk, staring at Carter with a look that made it clear this was no routine conversation, his eyes boring into him like a drill. Sit down. Hill ordered, his voice low but firm, a command that brooked no argument. Carter obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from the desk, his palms sweaty, the tension making it hard to breathe, each breath a struggle against the weight pressing on his chest. Hill didn't speak for a moment, just stared at Carter, as if trying to decide where to begin, his silence more damning than any words. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his voice cold, cutting.
Tell me what happened out there.
Carter swallowed, his throat dry, his thoughts a jumbled mess as he tried to gather himself. It was a misunderstanding, he stammered, his voice shaking, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. I didn't know he was with the CIA. I didn't know. That's not what I asked. Hill interrupted, his voice sharp, slicing through Carter's excuses like a hot knife. I asked what happened, from the moment you stopped that car to the moment you cuffed a federal agent on duty. Explain yourself. Carter's throat closed up, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like a boulder, each word he tried to form catching in his throat, choking him. I saw him sitting in the car, he began, his voice trembling, barely holding together. I thought he was suspicious. He didn't have plates, and he didn't look like he belonged there. Hill's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening, a storm brewing behind his gaze. He didn't look like he belonged?
That is your reason.
The question hit Carter like a punch, the truth in it stinging, exposing the ugly root of his actions. Carter flinched, his face burning with shame, knowing how it sounded, knowing how wrong it was. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't know. You didn't know. Hill repeated, his voice rising, laced with disbelief and anger. You didn't know because you didn't bother to listen. A man told you he was on a federal operation, offered you his credentials, and you ignored him. You cuffed him, threw him in the back of your car, and now this department is going to have to deal with the fallout from your colossal mistake. Carter's heart sank, the reality of his actions crashing over him like a wave, drowning him in regret and fear. How had it come to this? He'd been so sure, so certain he was in the right, but now, facing Hill's icy glare, he saw the truth laid bare. His prejudice had blinded him, and the cost was more than he could bear. Officer Ray Carter's face burned with shame, a searing heat that spread from his cheeks to his chest, leaving him exposed, defenseless. He had no excuse, no shield to hide behind. He knew it now, and the truth stung like a slap. Captain Hill leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly, the disappointment in his eyes cutting deeper than any words. This department can't afford officers who act on assumptions, Carter. Do you even realize how much damage you've caused? The CIA is breathing down our necks because of you. You put an entire operation at risk because you didn't stop to think. Hill's voice was a mix of anger and exasperation, each word a hammer driving the reality of Carter's failure deeper into his soul. How could he have been so reckless? I'm sorry. Carter whispered, his voice barely audible, a faint, broken sound that seemed to vanish into the air. I didn't mean for it to go this way, he added, his words trembling, pleading for some shred of understanding. Hill's expression softened just a fraction, but the weight of his disappointment remained, heavy and unyielding.
Sorry, it's not gonna cut it, Carter.
You've crossed a line we can't just walk back. Carter felt his heart plummet, a sickening drop that left him hollow. He knew what was coming, but hearing it was like a punch to the gut. You're suspended, effective immediately. Hill declared, his voice cold, final, like a judge's gavel slamming down. Turn in your badge and your weapon. You'll be lucky if suspension is all you get. Carter's mouth went dry, his eyes widening in shock, the word echoing in his mind like a cruel taunt. Suspended, he gasped, his voice cracking, barely able to process the blow. You're lucky you're not fired on the spot. Hill snapped, his tone sharp, unforgiving. But we'll let the review board decide that. Now turn in your badge and get out of here. Carter's hands trembled violently as he reached for his badge, his fingers fumbling as he unhooked it from his belt, the metal cold against his clammy skin. He placed it on the desk, the metallic clink ringing in his ears like a death knell, echoing through the sparse office. As he stood up to leave, a hollow emptiness settled in his chest, a void where his sense of purpose had once been. He'd gone from being in control, the one giving orders, to being stripped of everything he thought defined him. He had no one to blame but himself. How had it come to this? As Carter walked out of the station, his head bowed, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues boring into him, their silent judgment a weight that followed him with every step. The whispers, the sidelong glances, they were a chorus of condemnation, and there was no escaping it now. This was the consequence of his actions, a bitter pill he couldn't spit out. He stood outside the station, the heavy thud of the door closing behind him like a final judgment, leaving him alone on the sidewalk, staring blankly at the street. His badge was gone, his identity as an officer stripped away. He felt exposed, as if the uniform he still wore was a lie, a costume that no longer fit. The weight of the day's events pressed down on his shoulders like a vice, squeezing tighter with each shallow breath, threatening to crush him. Carter looked around, desperate for something familiar, something to anchor him in this storm, but all he could feel was the slow, sickening realization of how much he had lost. His hands shook at his sides, a chill running down his spine despite the warm June air. People walked past, going about their day, oblivious to the internal chaos raging through him, their normalcy a stark contrast to his unraveling world. Carter took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it did little to calm the tempest inside. He'd never felt this kind of helplessness before. It was always him in control, him giving the orders, making the calls, but now? Nothing. He had let his assumptions, his arrogance, his inability to see past his own biases rip everything away. How could he have been so blind? He walked slowly toward his car, parked in the station lot, his legs feeling weak, unsteady, like they might give out beneath him. The authority he once carried, that confident stride, was gone, replaced by a dull, aching void that pulsed with every step. As he reached the car, he paused, his hand resting on the driver's side door handle, the metal cool against his trembling fingers. For a moment he stood there, staring at his reflection in the window, his face pale, his eyes wide, unfocused, a stranger staring back. Who was this man? The radio call, the dispatcher's voice revealing David Smith's identity, still echoed in his mind: CIA agent. He had arrested a federal agent on duty. The weight of that truth was too much to bear, a crushing burden he couldn't shake. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross, and for what? A gut feeling, a snap judgment that David didn't belong in that neighborhood? The truth had hit him harder than any blow ever could. Carter finally opened the door and sank into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under his desperate hold. His mind was racing, a whirlwind of regret and panic, searching for something, anything, that could explain what he'd done, some shred of justification to cling to. But there was nothing, no excuse, no defense. He had let his prejudice dictate his actions, and now it had cost him everything. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp vibration that made him flinch, but he ignored it. How could he face the calls or texts from his colleagues, his family? What could he even say? That he'd ruined his career in a matter of minutes? That he'd let his arrogance and biases strip him of everything he'd worked for? The thought was unbearable. With trembling hands, he reached into the glove compartment, pulling out his police-issued notepad, the cover worn from years of use. The pages were filled with names, dates, notes on arrests he'd made over the years, a record of his service. At one point, he'd been proud of this, flipping through it with a sense of accomplishment, proof he was a good cop, someone who kept the community safe. But now, as he turned the pages, his vision blurred, the words swimming together. All he could see was how blind he'd been. The faces of the people he'd stopped, questioned, arrested over the years blurred in his mind, a parade of moments he'd never questioned. How many of them had felt like David did today, judged for no reason other than a gut feeling, a sense they didn't belong? He'd always told himself he was doing his job, protecting the community, but now, in the harsh light of this moment, it felt hollow, empty, a lie he'd told him.
Elf too many times.
Carter closed the notebook with a snap, tossing it onto the passenger seat, where it landed with a thud. His phone buzzed again, insistent, but this time he pulled it out, glancing at the screen with dread. It was a message from his wife, her name glowing on the display like a beacon of normalcy he no longer deserved. He stared at it, a fresh wave of shame crashing over him, threatening to drown him. What was he going to tell her? That he was suspended, likely to be fired, that the man she believed was a hero was now a public disgrace? His fingers hovered over the screen, trembling, but he couldn't bring himself to reply, the words refusing to form. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and leaned his head against the steering wheel, closing his eyes, the cool leather pressing against his forehead. The weight of the day was crushing him, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless, adrift in a sea of his own making. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense, electric with unspoken judgment. Word of Carter's blunder had spread like wildfire, officers whispering among themselves, their voices low but urgent, some casting wary glances toward the door, waiting for the next shoe to drop. No one said it aloud, but the message was clear: Carter was finished. His career, once so promising, had ended in disgrace, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. In the captain's office, Hill sat behind his desk, a stack of papers spread before him, his face etched with weariness. He was no stranger to disciplinary actions, but this one was different, heavier. The fallout from Carter's actions wouldn't just affect the department, it would ripple through the community, tarnishing the public's perception of the police force. Racial profiling, abuse of power, mishandling a federal agent, these were stains that wouldn't wash out easily. Hill sighed, rubbing his temples as he reviewed the incident report, the words blurring under his tired gaze. It was painfully clear from the start that Carter had acted on biases, not facts. He'd failed to listen, failed to ask the right questions, letting his assumptions drive him straight into a disaster of his own making. The phone on Hill's desk rang, jarring him from his thoughts. He picked it up, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Hill," he said, bracing himself. "Captain, it's about Carter," came the voice on the other end, clipped and urgent. "The review board wants to meet. They're pushing for immediate termination." Hill nodded, though the caller couldn't see, his jaw tightening. "I figured as much." Make sure the paperwork's ready. This has to be handled cleanly. As he hung up, Hill leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. He'd seen good officers fall before, but this one stung more. Carter had been one of the promising ones, a rising star, but in the end his pride, his prejudice, had brought him crashing down. Hours later, Carter still sat in his car, his mind numb, a fog of despair clouding his thoughts. When his phone buzzed again, he answered this time, his voice barely above a whisper, hollow and defeated. "Carter," he said, knowing who it was before the voice came through, dreading the inevitable. "Officer Carter," Hill's voice came through, firm but not angry, a tone of finality that left no room for hope. "It's over. The review board has made their decision. You're officially terminated from the force, effective immediately." Carter closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a blow to the chest, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real, a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "I understand," he replied, his voice flat, emotionless, drained of all fight. "I need you to come back in and finalize the paperwork," Hill continued, his tone professional but distant. "After that, you're free to go." Carter nodded, though Hill couldn't see, the gesture mechanical, empty. "I'll be there," he said, his voice a ghost of its former self. As he hung up, Carter sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the windshield, the world outside a blur. His career was over, but more than that, his sense of self was shattered, fragmented into pieces he didn't know how to rebuild. Everything he'd thought he knew about his job, about what it meant to be a good cop, had been ripped away in an instant. He started the car, the engine humming to life, a sound that felt too normal for the chaos inside him. As he pulled out of the lot, the station faded into the distance behind him, a symbol of everything he'd lost. Driving away, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just his job he'd lost. It was his sense of who he was, his place in the world, gone forever. David Smith stood next to his car, taking a deep breath, the warm June air filling his lungs as he felt the tension slowly ebb from his body. What a day! It had been long, exhausting, a grueling test of his resilience, and though the immediate danger was over, the weight of the encounter with Carter still pressed down on him, a heavy reminder of the battles he faced beyond his missions. He adjusted his jacket, the lingering ache in his wrists from the handcuffs a sharp, stinging memory. The pain wasn't just physical, it was a visceral reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, even now, after all these years, after everything he'd achieved. Moments like this brought back the same bitter truth. Some people would never see beyond the surface, never look past his skin to the man beneath. David closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself, grounding himself in the quiet of the suburban street. He couldn't let this derail him, not now. He still had a job to do, a mission that demanded his focus. He glanced down the street toward the house he'd been watching all afternoon, its windows dark, the target still inside. That house was his priority, the reason he was here, and Carter's actions had nearly blown it all to pieces. But the operation wasn't over. David couldn't afford to lose sight of the goal, not when so much was at stake. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the stillness, a sharp vibration that pulled him back to the present. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen, his superior's name glowing in the fading light.
A simple check-in. Everything clear on your end.
David stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen, a moment of reflection before he typed his reply.
All clear now.
Back on task. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his resilience, his refusal to be broken by Carter's prejudice. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his gaze returning to the house, his mind sharpening, refocusing on the mission. Carter was a memory now, a fleeting distraction in a career built on perseverance. David was still here, still standing, and that was all that mattered. David Smith stared at the glowing screen of his phone, his thumb hovering over the reply button, his heart still carrying the weight of the day's chaos.
All clear now.
Back on task, he typed, his words a defiant declaration that the mission was still alive, unbroken despite the storm that had raged around him. But beneath that simple message, there was something deeper, a truth that pulsed with quiet intensity. Physically, David had emerged unscathed, his body free of bruises, but emotionally? This was another searing reminder of the battle he'd been fighting his entire life, a battle against assumptions, against prejudice, against a world that too often saw only his skin and not the man beneath. He slipped the phone into his pocket, his jaw tightening as he turned his gaze back to the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. There was still work to be done, and he wouldn't let Carter's actions derail him from the bigger picture. The mission was everything. Sliding back into his car, David felt the familiar embrace of the driver's seat, the soft hum of the surveillance gear, a comforting rhythm that grounded him. The house across the street stood silent, its windows dark, the suspect inside blissfully unaware of the near disaster that had unfolded just moments ago. David took a deep breath, the warm June air filling his lungs, steadying his resolve.
Focus, David.
He had a job to finish, and no rogue cop was going to pull him off course. But as he settled in, his mind couldn't help but drift back to the day's events, replaying the confrontation with Officer Ray Carter like a film stuck on loop, the suspicion dripping from Carter's voice, the tension that had coiled tighter with each passing second, the cold, biting metal of the handcuffs digging into his wrists. How many times had he been here before? It wasn't the first time David had been reduced to a suspect in the wrong place at the wrong time, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. Despite his position, his years of service, his unwavering dedication, he'd been stripped of his identity, judged by the color of his skin alone. Why did it always come to this? David wasn't angry anymore, not really. He'd learned long ago how to process this kind of injustice, how to let it settle deep within him without letting it consume his soul. Anger wouldn't serve him, not out here in the field where every decision was life or death. But the disappointment? That lingered like a bitter aftertaste, a quiet ache in his chest. Disappointment in people like Carter, in the system that had shaped him, in the countless others who jumped to conclusions without ever pausing to listen. How many times had he seen it? Officers who acted first, asked questions later, so sure they were the heroes of their own story. Carter had been one of them, strutting with that smug certainty, believing his badge gave him the right to judge. But David had known from the start it would fall apart, it always did. Carter's arrogance had been his undoing, and now he was gone, a fleeting shadow in David's rearview mirror. Still, as David watched the house, its silhouette stark against the fading light, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had shifted inside him. Carter was out of the picture, but the impact of what had happened? That wouldn't fade so easily. It never did. The system would keep churning, spitting out officers like Carter, each carrying their own biases, their own snap judgments. And David? He'd keep doing his job, navigating a world where his skin color made him a target just as much as his skill set made him an asset. Why couldn't it ever be just about the work? He adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of himself, his face calm but etched with fatigue, the lines around his eyes telling a story of resilience forged in fire. The sun was sinking, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood, bathing it in a deceptive peace. This was the kind of quiet Carter believed he was protecting, wasn't it? But peace built on ignorance, on assumptions, wasn't peace at all. It was a fragile illusion, waiting for a single moment of truth to shatter it. David's phone buzzed again, a sharp vibration that snapped him back to the present. He glanced at the screen, scanning the update on the operation with practiced efficiency. The suspect was still inside, no movement yet. Good. That meant there was still time, still a chance to complete the mission without further interruption. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes locked on the house, settling into the familiar rhythm of surveillance, the hum of the gear a steady heartbeat. His mind was clear now, laser-focused on the task at hand. The operation came first, always. But as the minutes ticked by, Carter's face crept back into his thoughts, unbidden, unwanted. How different could this day have been if the officer had just listened? Just taken one moment to check the ID, to see David for who he was, a CIA agent, not a stereotype? In the end, Carter had lost everything because he couldn't see past his own biases. David had seen it in his eyes, that split second when the truth hit, the dawning horror of a mistake he couldn't undo. The officer's world had crumbled in that moment, his smug certainty replaced by panic regret. But it wasn't David's job to teach him that lesson, to hold his hand through the consequences. It wasn't his responsibility to fix a broken system that churned out men like Carter. His only job was to finish what he'd started, to protect, to serve, to do his part, no matter how many times the world tried to reduce him to something less. He glanced at the house one more time, his eyes scanning every detail, ensuring everything was still in place, before leaning back in his seat, the leather creaking softly beneath him. The evening air was cooler now, slipping through the cracked window, the neighborhood sinking into a quiet calm that felt almost surreal after the day's chaos. David stayed vigilant, his body relaxed but his mind sharp, a finely tuned instrument ready for action. There would always be people like Carter, wouldn't there? Men who saw only what they wanted to see, who let their biases write the story before the facts could speak. And there would always be moments like this one, confrontations that tested his resolve, his patience, his strength. But David wasn't here to dwell on that, to let those moments define him. He was here to do his job, to carry out the mission with the precision and dedication that had brought him this far. Nothing, not even a bad cop with a chip on his shoulder, would stop him from doing what needed to be done. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the street in deep velvety shadows, David allowed himself a small quiet breath, a moment of release amidst the tension. The mission wasn't over, but he had weathered the storm, come through the fire unbroken. He was still here, still standing, still ready for whatever came next. And that, in the end, was all that mattered: his resilience, his purpose, his unwavering commitment to the job, no matter the cost.